I won't lie to you. The past 2 years have been incredibly challenging for me, a sentiment I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. Before the pandemic, I was in one of the best periods of my life. I had just finished grad school, finally, after years of turning down invites and spending 12-hour days in the library, when I wasn't spending all of my other available hours working. I had just participated in my first PAX panel, an item that had been on the bucket list for a near decade, and I was finally able to put more time into friendships, growing my business, and of course, the occasional video game. Losing out on that, trading the non-stop hype train that my life had become for a life of solitude in my apartment, impacted me in a lot of ways. Many of those ways I didn't even expect. Certain things helped, sure. Making more videos, for instance, really helped to keep me grounded. Not to mention, I always had games to count on. From fun experiences like Paper Mario the Origami King to revisiting my favorite game in Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, I had massive, sprawling adventures to help me feel engaged at a time where I felt really disconnected from the world around me. But no game really helped to ground me quite like Persona 5 Royal. Persona 5 Royal woke me up. Like, after playing the final palace, the themes resonated with me so much that I actually put in my notice at my job the next day after finishing the game. Vanilla P5 was a special experience too, and when it ended, even though I felt satisfied, there was always this subtle emptiness in my spirit. I discussed this in my last P5 video. The game tasks you with falling in love with it, and then when you do so, it demands of you to say a heartfelt goodbye. That's why I was so genuinely thrilled when I learned the Phantom Thieves would be making a grand return in a musou-esque spin-off. But what I didn't expect to find when I finally gave Strikers a go was a return to form so profoundly familiar and comfortable that by the end of it, I remembered what it was I couldn't wait to return to. This game became hope for me at a time when I really needed it. But you guys know how I do. My feelings don't make a game good, at least not on their own. Today, we're going to take a deep yet spoiler-free dive into the world of Persona 5 Strikers, or as some have taken to calling it, Persona 5 2. Persona 5 Strikers is an action RPG set 1 year after the events of the original Persona 5, and invites you on the summer vacation of a lifetime, including a road trip across all of Japan, and the opportunity to slay shadows in some of the most high-octane, fast-paced combat the series has ever seen. All of this is wrapped beautifully into that charming P5 aesthetic that we've all grown so fond of. But make no mistake, for everything this game does to bring you back to your time with its predecessor, it just as frequently makes sure to strike its own path forward, resulting in one of the greatest spin-off and sequel experiences I've had the pleasure of experiencing in quite some time. The premise of Strikers sets its tone fairly well, with Joker returning to Tokyo for summer vacation, and the metaverse being used by influential people across Japan to change the hearts of those around them, and certainly not for the better. After accidentally being sucked into a jail, a new palace-like dungeon within the metaverse, Joker reassembles the Phantom Thieves along with Sophie, an AI found in the metaverse who becomes fast friends with our favorite thieves. Together they must unravel the secrets of the jail, no matter where it might take them. This game knows exactly what it has to do. I mean, even the way it opens with Futaba texting you, "It's been a while, hasn't it?" is as much of a wink and nod as you could ever ask for, and the game wastes no time dropping you back into the story you know and love. Without skipping a beat, you're thrown into the action, but this time, rather than the bottle mystery format of the original game, this flash forward is only a few days into the game's story. So there are plenty of surprises, and for those of you with the forethought to skip the opening credits, no game-spoiling hints in sight. Some of my feedback about the original game was centered around its episodic structure, specifically in how it supported greater story ideas, allowing individual arcs to stand on their own, rather than being dependent on the overarching story. While this created a more underwhelming story for some, for me it allowed me to better take each day as it came, and ultimately helped the story to feel like a consequence of the way my version of Joker lived his life, rather than the other way around. It supported the agency that Persona games are so committed to providing. Fast forward to this game, and obviously we've got to condense that story down some. Things like confidants are gone in favor of focusing on the core party, something that the original game was actually in great need of. I admired how well-rounded the cast was in Persona 5, allowing tertiary characters to stand out in a way that contributed to the overall feel of the world. But compared to Persona 4, for instance, which did a great job of making its core cast feel like a legit group of friends, 5's core party didn't quite stack up. Characters like Haru, for instance, faded to the background because of their placement in the story. Taking the sequel as an opportunity to further endear us to characters is a great way to build on what's already been established. In addition, a pared-down cast allows for an overarching story, because it prevents there from being too many moving parts. Of course, it helps that any new characters introduced to the story are pretty damn cool. Characters like Sophie feel like they've been around the entire time, and thanks to great vocal performances and strong quirky character writing, they add some new angles that take the existing characters and bolster them even further. We also get as much excitement as you would expect from a brand new cast, just because of how familiar this game feels. I've seen people accuse this game of flanderizing its characters, a concept from sitcoms where over time characters become boiled down to a singular personality trait. And while I can see that argument for a character like Makoto, whose academic prowess is a lot of the focus of her dialogue this time around, I'm inclined to disagree as it pertains to other characters. Morgana still feels like the wise and sassy cat we know and love, complete with his adoration for Lady Ann and his admiration of Joker. Ann's signature sweetness is once again contrasted by her willingness to lay down the hurt. One common complaint about Persona 5 is that the dialogue in that game felt quite repetitive. I won't argue that. I think the game spends a lot of time spelling things out for you. Sure, with a 100-hour campaign, you want to make sure people are well recapped fairly frequently. A lot of people stop playing and then come back to games of that length, so it makes sense to have characters discuss recent events in that way. That said, Strikers is a much shorter game, so it has the added benefit of what I personally consider to be a much tighter script. The overall storytelling isn't necessarily elevated, but each moment of the game feels far more confidently delivered. Add to this a level of comfort and confidence that each of the already proficient voice actors displays for their character, and it's not particularly shocking that this game feels as consistently lighthearted and fun as it does, even when it's approaching certain darker messages and themes. For this review, I'm going to focus on three things: story, character, plot structure, plot delivery, presentation, which would encompass visuals, music, and UI, and gameplay, combat, the overworld, and of course, the ridiculous HP sponge bosses. There's always some overlap in how some facets complement one another, but I think these fundamentals will be the clearest way to measure the quality of something like Persona 5 Strikers. Starting with the gameplay, I would say it's divided into two sections, not unlike its main game counterpart. The first is the navigation of the overworld, which allows you to explore the city, speak to other characters, buy items, and manage your inventory through various activities. This is the segment that will probably feel most familiar to those of us that played Persona 5. Cities like Shibuya still feel completely intact from their original incarnations, and locations that are exclusive to this game still manage to capture the presentation style of the original game, while also having a surprisingly new feeling to them. To elaborate on that, I'll use one of the game's earliest locations, Sendai. This location has the staples of a Persona 5 town: shopping centers, cool restaurants, eclectic and engaging characters. It maintains that metropolitan feel that helped separate Persona 5 from its predecessor, and in that way, it feels like a natural destination for the characters we've come to know. In addition to that familiar feeling, the amplified historical context in architecture, differences in cuisine, and most of all, musical stylings, do help to separate Sendai from the Shibuya that we're familiar with. This theme persists throughout the game, and narratively it helps to reinforce that sense of unfamiliarity of each new area to fit into the road trip theme. There's still an underlying sense of discovery that permeates throughout every area you'll explore, and this is especially effective as that unfamiliarity almost never feels like a negative unless the game wants it to. But I'd be getting ahead of myself to discuss that any further. Anyway, a lot of the elements of P5S and its overworld will only really hold value to you if you were big into the original game. Little details like dialogue from the core cast, or the ability to buy items or do side quests just to make your friends like you more, are the main appeal. You only spend time in the overworld doing investigations for the main story. The rest of the content within these areas is mostly optional, but essential to making this game feel like a proper continuation. Once you transition into the metaverse, once again you're confronted with familiar exploration. The jails that replace palaces in this game will offer a similar level of exploration, but introduce quite a few of their own mechanics as well, including a jump button, which is wild. The ambush from Persona 5 is still present, but there are a few ways to trigger combat whether you strike from behind or not. A good example of this is the use of the gun in the overworld section. You can use Joker's trusty pistol or Noir's explosive weapon to blast foes away, triggering battles from a distance. And did I mention that you can navigate the metaverse with more than just Joker this time? Each and every Phantom Thief is able to freely run around and explore. Unfortunately, there are a couple of absent parties, notably anyone introduced in Persona 5 Royal does not appear in this game. This is a bummer, and in my opinion, easily the worst part of the game, but the introduction of a new party member in the form of Sophie and the existing thieves make up what I would consider to be a fantastic roster of diverse moves and, as always, vibrant aesthetic. Jails also introduced new mechanics, such as a reworking of the security level system from the previous game. Instead of making the dungeon more difficult, increased security level will now make treasure inaccessible, and ambushes far more difficult to pull off. In addition to this, the game introduces some minor platforming elements as well, a far cry from the palace navigation of old. There are even some 2.5D segments where you platform while avoiding spotlights that increase the security level. To recap, exploration of the real world and the metaverse have enough familiarity to stay cohesive with good old Persona 5, but introduces and explores enough new ideas to differentiate the experience. And this only ramps up when you get into the meat of what this game truly is. Persona 5 Strikers trades in the turn-based RPG combat of the original game for a Musou-inspired action RPG hybrid. The combat here is definitely designed with that classic Omega Force structure to its controls, but you'll find it to be very different from what you might be familiar with, even if you are a longtime Musou fan. I personally have always liked those games for their mindlessness and incredible attention to detail as it pertains to the concept of game feel. Of course, Persona fans are going to want something with a little bit more strategic depth to line up with their experience in the main games. And while I do feel combat is structurally very different from that turn-based experience, measures have been taken to marry the two, and I would say to much success. Make no mistake, the standard Musou fare is still present here: light hits, heavy hits, guarding, strafing, and of course, fighting through hordes. This time, however, there's a whole bunch of Persona-specific flavor to help mix things up. For one, the elemental affinity system from the main series is here in full force, with shadows having strengths and weaknesses nearly identical to the original game. Of course, the same applies to your party members and their personas. Personas themselves manifest in one of two ways: using a heavy attack to finish a combo following a series of light attacks will launch into a skill summoned by a persona, triggering an elemental ability and targeting your foe with a direct strike to their weakness. The second means is actually summoning your persona in battle, and activating a skill that covers a certain area. These skills are very true to the source material, with buffs, debuffs, and affinities remaining intact. The diversity of enemies in this game is absolutely its bread and butter, as it stops each combat section from feeling obvious in the way that it might in a more traditional Musou title. Unfortunately, there are some areas where this falls flat. If you've seen even a single review of this game, you've probably heard about the HP sponge enemies. Be it mini-bosses, regular bosses, or even just strong enemies, certain fights can become a real grind. This wasn't ever really a problem in Persona 5, which was fast-paced compared to a lot of other turn-based RPGs. With Strikers being an action game, it's a lot more tedious compared to its peers in that genre. Not to mention, the boss enemies hit hard, even with adequate leveling and optimal gear. You can take a fall within 1 or 2 hits sometimes, wiping out all of that hard work and usually quite a bit of time. The good thing is that unlike the base game, if Joker bites it, you'll simply switch to the controlling of another party member, rather than dying instantly. There's something to be said for some good ebb and flow in a game like this. peaks and valleys in my mind are emblematic of risks taken, some that paid off and some that fell flat. While for the most part I would say the combat in Persona 5 itself is generally more engaging than this game, I do feel like the transition to traditional action was handled with tact, and serves as an excellent thread to tie story beats together, as well as puzzle solving. One element that helps to connect these disparate pieces are the side quests. You won't be spending any time in the dark urban labyrinth of Mementos this time around, but each and every jail you visit can be returned to following its completion. Rather than changing hearts, your quests will have more dynamic requirements, such as hunting down certain materials, defeating specific shadows, finding items in the game's overworld, talking to NPCs, making recipes. All of these quests contribute to your bond points, which replace confidant abilities in this game. These points can be used on permanent party upgrades, such as increased EXP, yen, health or SP, or even different combat skills. In addition to this, specific quests will unlock extra dialogue with other members of your party. I love the application of side quests in this game, not only because their structure feels more akin to Persona 4's quests, but also because the rewards feel consistent with what a Persona fan would value. Let's be honest, at this stage, we're not here for the combat, we're not even here to see what schemes are taking place in the metaverse. We missed the gang. We wanted to get back out there and see our friends again. This game reinforces that love in a very special way, and I look forward to diving into that further as I discuss the story. As you've probably noticed, this game is pretty deep for being a spin-off. Even though things like the calendar system and social links don't exist here, at least not in their usual shape, the experience still feels very well-rounded, and gives the sense that the way you use your time will still contribute to the overall bigger picture. Add to that interesting and unique world designs and a fresh take on combat, and Persona 5 Strikers hits it out of the park on this front, despite some hiccups in the overall game's balance. To discuss presentation in this game is likely to create a lot of redundancies. Visually, the style is practically one-to-one for Persona 5's unique and now quite famous visual flair. The execution of this style in a more traditional action game feels right at home, because of how consistently action-packed turn-based combat felt in the original title. The motion blurs, splashing sounds, the ground and the red waves that surround your feet as you take every step, UI, and everything else in this game just feels like an iteration of the home you've known and loved for the last 4 years. As I mentioned earlier, the new areas you explore are very much thematically in line with the game's original locations, but they offer enough that feels entirely new to prevent this from feeling like boring repetition. A lot of the jail locations, for example, have visual styles quite unlike any of the palaces we saw in the original game. The first two, for example, are a carnival and a fantasy kingdom. Having level design like this helps the game pave its own path separate from its predecessor. Strikers has a pretty strong sense of identity, and nowhere is this clearer than its presentation, but the visual choices are a mere fraction of this. If you've played any Persona game, main game, spin-off, or otherwise, you know the role music plays in a game's identity. For vanilla P5, it was this smooth lounge jazz to reinforce the suave gentleman thief aesthetic. For P4, it was the upbeat pop rock punk vibes to accompany the youthful vibrance, or even for Royal in its particularly somber musical flavor. Strikers chooses to level up, advancing P5's original jazz soundtrack to a stylized rock ensemble not unlike that of the traditional Musou titles. Of course, Lynn's stellar vocals make their return to enhance arrangements of old songs and define new ones. Battle tracks like Axe to Grind sound very different from Last Surprise, but still evoke that same feeling, like I'm about to put on the show of a lifetime. That said, for me, the winning tracks actually come from the real-world areas. When you first park the Feathermobile in Sendai, this upbeat music takes over, creating this underlying sense of borderline nostalgic fun, which is particularly interesting for me as I've never been to anywhere resembling Sendai myself. But there's this fun inclination almost, a sense of momentum to each city track that invites you to explore, reminding you that this is more than just another adventure to save the world. You're hanging out with your friends and you're on vacation. You may as well enjoy it. Now, on the flip side of this, I have to admit, the individual jail music didn't really add much for me. And I hate to say that, as I realize this is a very subjective matter, but some of the tracks, while in theme with the design of the levels, felt quite generic to the world's aesthetic, and not that exciting Persona spin that we're used to. All in all, the presentation is excellent, and the game's performance on PS4 is absolutely perfect. I seldom noticed any frame rate drops at all, including sequences with a great many characters on screen. Musou games are typically pretty good about that sort of thing, and I haven't played the Switch version yet to account for that, but I have seen that load times and resolution are quite disappointing compared to the PlayStation versions. I'd recommend this thing on the console it belongs to, and I'll leave it at that. In addition, you do get neat little rewards from having save data from Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royal, so that's pretty cool and I think exclusive to PlayStation. Finally, let's talk about the story of this JRPG spin-off, which manages to do some incredible things, even in its shortened runtime. Strikers is every bit the sequel Persona 5 deserved, and offers a return to form so definitive that it replicated feelings I had thought long gone from my life. Starting with the game's premise, the theme of welcoming a player home feels to ring true in every possible sense. The year time skip between P5's ending and the start of this game helps those introductory chapters to feel like you're getting caught up on the happenings in your absence. And for what it's worth, not a lot seems to have changed. But the very sentiment of characters being excited to see and talk to Joker about what they've been up to helps to create that surrogate experience that the Avatar characters often aim for, but fall just shy of. The introduction of jails helps to create a new spin on a familiar territory. Of course we know the metaverse, and the moment you're sucked back in feels like you're back in business, an idea further emphasized by the game's expert use of last surprise in the first real battle. Where I think Strikers truly excels is its ability to flesh out characters who might not have gotten the attention they deserved in the main game. Obviously Haru is the example that comes to mind, but the way in which these characters are expanded upon is downright fascinating. Rather than simply expositing their feelings or harping on ideas, the palace rulers, which are monarchs in this game, will often share parallels with members of our main cast, serving as a reflection on one of two things. The first is what they could have become without crossing paths with their fellow Phantom Thieves, a prime example being that in the first jail, where the monarch's tragic past shares a striking resemblance to that of dear An. Because of this, An takes personal ownership of overcoming this particular obstacle, and does so with that signature brand of empathy and compassion that endears us to her in the first place. Of course, the same can be said of Yusuke and Haru, as well as others in coming chapters of the story. There's a rewarding feeling that comes from seeing these versions of our characters, stepping up to help others overcome the same struggles we witnessed them experiencing during our first journey. Because of this, the monarchs feel somewhat less like caricatures than the palace rulers did. Admittedly, the characterization still feels a little thin for this group of baddies, but it's a vehicle to tell us more about our own cast, and it's effective. As I stated earlier, Sophie, the new AI companion that joins you when you first enter the metaverse, is undoubtedly a perfect fit for the Phantom Thieves. Her brand of adorable, naive humor helps to endear us to her immediately, and her obvious connection to the story is an excellent through-line to keep players guessing. In addition to this, there are some other new characters who add quite a bit to the overall narrative, but the bulk of love will be shown to our existing cast. The story itself isn't particularly groundbreaking, but it never really needed to be. A lot of us were just looking for more of the same, a return to the comforts of home, if you will. And this game offers exactly that, with characters, settings, and even in some ways combat feeling like an extension of what we're already familiar with. The road trip premise itself feels like a fantastic way to section off our main party and allow them to celebrate the friendship forged in the fires of P5's massive adventure. And the camper idea was so infectiously fun, especially during a time where travel was so limited for us real-life players. The writing in this game leans on comedy quite a bit, and does so in a way that feels very respectful to how fans feel about these characters. There's so much fan service to be found here, and not just in the usual Persona way. Characters often make callbacks to their funniest moments from P5, The structures of jails are similar to palaces in a lot of ways, and actually lends itself to some pretty cool callbacks to some of the hypest moments from the original game. The Phantom Thieves, to me, appeared in a completely different light this time around. There was a sort of rebellious undertone inherent to Persona 5's aesthetic and plot. Authority was the enemy, and that was reinforced by the plot in numerous ways. But because the monarchs are less cruel than palace rulers, because our characters have grown and changed as a result of their own struggles, this isn't a game about fighting back, it's a game about saving people, even from themselves. It's something the cast never quite figured out how to do back when they were dealing with a certain crow, and it feels so meaningful to see them overcome that and be able to fight that battle now. On a more personal note, I mentioned in my Persona 5 Royal review that nothing to me is as important as finding good people to share your life with. I stand by that, but just as important as making good friends is keeping them. That requires being attentive, being loyal, understanding what you loved about them in the first place, and cultivating those traits at all costs. Persona 5 Strikers is a game about cultivating the best of who we are, and doing so within ourselves and each other. At the start of this, I described the hardship of being away from my friends and family throughout the pandemic. Some of that struggle manifests as sadness, anger, confusion, but I think the scariest of those is when those thoughts turn to apathy. When that helplessness and hopelessness somewhere along the way starts to feel numb. But community, and consequently camaraderie, exist where you make them. And sometimes a little reminder from a fictional character or two is all it takes to remember. Whether you think so or not, people are excitedly waiting to see you again. So just make sure that when that time comes, be it someone you haven't seen in a while, a long-distance friend, or whoever it may be, that when you do get back together, you continue to cultivate the best of one another. Well, that, and try to stop any potential conspiracies that might be taking place in a parallel universe adjacent to your meeting spot. There you have it, folks. This will be my second to last upload of the year, or my last, it really depends. That Kiryu character study I mentioned is now exceeding the 35-40 minute mark, so we'll see. I am happy either way that I was able to bookend this year with another Persona video. For the patient, those who stuck with me throughout the chaos of this year, I greatly appreciate you, and hope that you get a chance to give any of the games I've talked about a good honest try. As always, I want to thank you all for watching, and come back soon for more from the Game Roomies.